Good evening. You're very welcome to this evening's launch of A History of Irish Women's Poetry, a groundbreaking and comprehensive new account of Irish women's poetry from earliest times to the present day in both English and Irish. Here at MoLI, we're delighted to host this event in partnership with the Embassy and Consulates General of Ireland in the UK. My name is Simon O'Connor. I'm the director here at MoLI, the Museum of Literature Ireland. We're located on Dublin St Stephen's Green. Don't forget, we are open now 6 days a week, Tuesday to Sunday from 10:30 a.m. to 6 p.m. With late opening on Thursdays until 7:30 p.m. So do pop in, visit us soon and say hello if you're passing. This evening, we're very fortunate to be joined by the book's editors, Ailbhe, Darcy and David Wheatley, and they'll be in conversation with Professor Sarah Prescott, who is the Dean and Principal of the College of Arts and Humanities at UCD. And we'll also get the opportunity to hear readings from poets Ciara and Rachael Hegarty. So a really fantastic evening in store, and a big thank you in advance to all of our speakers and of course our friends in the Embassy and Consulates General. If you do enjoy tonight's programme, I'd encourage you to make a donation to the museum. So MoLI depends on donations to help us continue to deliver our ambitious programme to audiences at home and abroad, in person and online. So if you would like to make a donation, which would be most valuable, you can visit moli.ie/support to find out more. But that is enough from me. I'm going to hand you over to Denise Hanrahan, Consul General of Ireland in Cardiff, to introduce our speakers, and we hope you enjoy the evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon, and welcome to all of you. Thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Denise Hanrahan. I'm the Consul General of Ireland in Cardiff, and it's a really great honour on behalf of the Embassy of Ireland to the UK and our now 3 Consulates General in Cardiff, Edinburgh and Manchester to be partnering with the wonderful Museum of Literature Ireland for this evening's launch of A History of Irish Women's Poetry. The co-editors of this groundbreaking collection of critical essays, Ailbhe, Darcy and David Wheatley, are poets and academics in their own right, each respectively based in Cardiff and in Aberdeen. And I think this really speaks to 2 of the most important calling cards and strengths that Ireland has internationally, our diaspora and our artists, particularly writers. In the last period, in recent years, we've learned so much about the importance of listening to a diversity of voices, be that internationally, in Ireland, society, politically and beyond. We'd therefore really welcome this history of Irish women's poetry and look forward to an uplifting and really insightful conversation this evening between Ailbhe, David and Sarah Prescott. Over to you.
Thank you very much to Simon.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. My name's Sarah Prescott. As Simon said, I'm the Principal and Dean of the College of Arts and Humanities at University College Dublin. And I'm absolutely delighted to be able to be here and kind of chair the discussion between Ailbhe and David, who are the editors of this fantastic and, as Denise said, really groundbreaking volume of critical essays on Irish women's poetry. And also very honoured to be a contributor myself on Anglophone 18th century women poets in the volume. So thank you very much for including me. I'd like to kick off with a general question really to you both, is just at what point did you decide to do this, to take this on as a project and to edit this book? And why did you think it was important? What kind of moved you to do this and to actually go from kind of chatting about it to doing it? And could you also say something, I think, when answering that, about how you made decisions about the scope of the book, the kind of chronological range, because it's a very ambitious volume, and you know, congratulations to you for its ambition. It works brilliantly. And I also wondered how that scope shaped the story that you could see emerging as you edited the chapters.
Sarah, before we answer, can I just say thank you to you as well for doing this. It's lovely to have you here, and it's very much beyond the call of duty for a contributor, so thank you. And I also want to say how exciting it is to be doing this with the book in my hands, because David and I have done a couple of events before this. You've all got the book and kind of waiting for the book to arrive, so it's here now, and that's a big deal. So I think for us, the seed of this project was planted in, I suppose it was 2017, when the Cambridge Companion to Irish Poets was announced, and the contents page of that volume was shared online, and people were kind of expressing disappointment at the scope of that volume. So that was a volume that sort of failed to take advantage of the full range of scholarship done in the field of Irish poetry. It had 30 chapters, each dedicated to a named poet, and only 4 of the poets were women. So David and I started corresponding about that volume and about the kind of response to it on the literary scene. And one thing I noticed myself in that response, and I think I myself kind of, could be included in this at the time, was that when people named the poets that they thought should have been in that book and weren't, they tended to always name poets from the 20th and the 21st centuries, particularly from kind of the emergence of Eva and Boland on. So I think there's always this kind of reiteration of a sort of tokenistic group of poets, and then a loss of the fuller, richer picture. So that was when we kind of realized that there was an appetite and need for a volume like this that would give a sort of an overview of the full history of Irish women's poetry, and would give it from the earliest times and not just the sort of the most recent bit. So that's at least part of the reason for the kind of ambitious scope, which, as you say, it sweeps all the way from earliest medieval times to the present day. And we wanted to recognize that women's poetry making, if it predates Ireland, right? It predates the idea of the nation state, and to see women's poetry as comprehending an oral tradition as well as a literary one. So going beyond the story of the nation, going beyond kind of the obsession with the published text, and going beyond the kind of the individual sort of genius author that we tend to value in Ireland particularly. David, what do you want to add to that?
I think that any big project like this coming together represents a marriage of, or an encounter of, accident and necessity. I think even before we began, if you imagine it somehow existing like a platonic idea in the ether, then we have to coax it out. You might begin by saying, we need to have a chapter on so-and-so, or you might just as easily say, we need to have a chapter by so-and-so. What would so-and-so like to write? And then you ask them, and they don't give you the obvious answer, the thing they've written, so many times before. They say, in fact, this time around, I'd like to do this instead. And so, we do begin with a certain contour of what the project is going to look like, but then it shifts shape and comes into focus in unexpected ways in the act of actually doing it.
Sarah, is it okay to put that question back at you and ask you, as a contributor, why you felt like a book like this should exist, and why you wanted to contribute your chapter to it?
Yeah, well, first of all, I was delighted to see that it was happening, and really thrilled to be involved in such an important kind of revisionist project. I think some of the reasons you said. Firstly, I think it's simply that the book fills a crucial gap or gaps, and that's just kind of really obvious in our knowledge of Irish women's poetry. Like you say, we're either from kind of the 21st century or from the early modern or medieval, and what's great about this, it kind of gives you that scope. But it also explores, I think, which was really intriguing, was why those gaps have occurred, why those omissions, why those silencings, why those silenced, actually, and also kind of thinks about how we might stop that happening again. Because it's a pattern in women's production, literary production. I won't say writing, because it's not strictly writing as such, where women kind of get recovered and then neglected, then recovered and then neglected. It's partly about the fragility of manuscript and kind of oral transmission, but it is also a critical paradigm that keeps happening. So I thought that was, you were doing really important revisionist work. And again, I've mentioned the ambitious chronological range, and I thought that was really interesting too. And what you have there is what I think David touched on, was the diversity of subjects and of scholars included in it. I mean, the title's A History, but it's not the history. So I think maybe that's deliberate. It could be many histories, or it could be different histories told within one volume, perhaps from more fractured histories to more kind of optimistic, looking forward narratives. And I think another really important part of this work is that it's at once an act of revisionist recovery, but it's also an account of the present and a look forward. So it's not this tidy history where you've got a beginning and end, and that's it, that's the narrative, that's the teleology, that's where we've got to. It's a living, breathing continuum as a volume. And I think it's something that should shape the future, as well as describe and explore and complicate the past as well. And I think, the subtitle of Anne Mulholland's last chapter, which is Beyond the Now, I think really kind of nicely encapsulates that as well. And I could go on forever, but I think my final observation would be that you have poetry produced in Irish and in English, and you also explore bilingual literary culture as well, because of a history of women's poetry just in English would only be half told without the Irish language. And I think the chapters as a whole show how we need to shift away, and my chapter sort of talks about this as well, from Anglo-centric paradigms to creating a history that is kind of coming out of its particular context rather than being compared to particular critical paradigms. And I think you talk about that very interestingly in the introduction, about how sometimes those critical paradigms fit and how sometimes they really might not be helpful. So I think that was those are some of the reasons why I was so excited. I'm just thrilled to see the end result. It's fantastic.
But on a related note, Sarah, your chapter is titled Archipelagic Ireland, Women's Anglophone Poetry from the 18th Century. Now, you mentioned, I think, the guru of archipelagic studies, John Kerrigan, who I remember writing, I think you may even quote this line, that the poetry of the nation, any of these nations can only be or can be best understood in the archipelagic context. And we reach the limits, the points at which the nation as narrative simply fails to explain the full extent of activity going on in and between Britain, Ireland, England, Ireland, Scotland and Wales at the period. Well, therefore, what is a word like Ireland and Irish doing, in the titles of these essays and books that we're producing these days? How do we account for that?
I mean, with the archipelagic approach, I come at it really, I'm kind of adumbrating this term archipelagic feminism, which would be part of the feminist recovery project, which again is about sort of, to put it in very simple terms, being comparative rather than Anglo-centric. One of the things I always get asked when I was working on Welsh women writers was, is there a Welsh Jane Austen? It's like, no, that's completely the wrong question. I'm not interested in a Welsh Jane Austen. I'm interested in actually what that tradition is telling me, or what that writing is telling me from that particular context and place. And I think in terms of kind of national traditions, when we're talking about kind of pre-nationalism, if you like, it's about islands and Irishness and very different kind of complexities and pluralities of identity. I think it is what comes across here, and that comes across very strongly in the essays as well. It's not just one tradition, it's not just one history, it's a multiplicity of voices. And I think that's what the archipelagic frame kind of lets you see.
Yeah. I think it's a very good way of addressing the straw man or a straw woman of the Irish national tradition that we all feel we somehow possess and understand here, the Daniel Corkery model. And then we go with these archipelagic forays. But, I think a book like this shows the limits of our conventional understanding of what we assume the Daniel Corkery, Irish national narrative actually can do for us.
Yeah, I think that, and picking up on that, we have noticed I noticed the key importance of including Irish language women poets in that as well. And I think that shifts those narratives again as well, which is really interesting. And I wonder if you could say a little bit more, both of you, about perhaps talking about a couple of examples of Irish language women poets in the volume that you think particularly kind of stood out for you.
Ailbhe, I've been talking. You want to go first?
Not particular poets so much, but Danielle Clark and Sarah McKibben have written a really interesting chapter, which just harks back to what you guys have just been saying about these kind of the pluralities of traditions, where they read 17th century Anglophone poetry alongside 17th century Irish language poetry. These are two traditions that exist side by side and aren't in conversation at all. But once you read them under the lens of gender, you see the ways in which they're sort of comparable. They're dealing with kind of this complicated negotiation with a public voice in sort of comparable ways. So I thought that was really interesting. I think it was also really interesting to read. So once we've kind of taken that sweep through the oral tradition and from early medieval through the 17th through the 18th centuries, later on then to look at the modern poetry and how the modern poetry picks up on that oral tradition, and it has there's a kind of Daniela Tanova talks about a kind of historical vacuum that they're dealing with, where they're looking back at a time when the Irish language and Irish literature would have been at its peak, but at the same time they're writing in a moment where it's very much alive and kicking, and how they're kind of negotiating those two truths, and sort of constantly renewing the language out of that. So I think you see the modern poets differently than once you've sort of read about the oral tradition in the Irish language.
I would just add that if in the archipelagic model, if we're hopping between territories, we also hop between different time frames. In my own chapter, which I had great fun writing, that was quite a challenge, with Biddy Jenkinson writing about the Gaelic 16th century in our own County Wicklow. I'm from there too, writing about Fake MacEula Bird and things like that. And I mean, the incredible kind of audacity with which she simply enters that Gaelic world. Writes about having a copy of the Bardic book, the Lara Brannock, in the car park there in Glenmalure, and then you're at the court of Fake MacHugh, which maybe most people know from that Planxty song from their first album. But the sheer kind of intellectual command that she has over that material, and which is, without any question, very obscure. But for me to enter that world was a great adventure and pleasure.
It's really interesting. I think we're a couple of minutes before our first reading, which nicely feeds off this, and it starts with a reading of a 17th century poem in Irish. But one question came from Daniel Clark in the chat, which I think was about how do you balance, and the kind of oral tradition comes into this because it isn't necessarily about individual authors as such, or about kind of texts that are being transmitted. How do you balance the sort of grand narrative with a focus on individual kind of canon formation, who's in, who's out? I think that's hopefully Daniela what you're getting at.
I mean, that was one of the first questions we grappled with, I think, isn't it, David? And again, kind of coming from this this model where you might write a history by taking a bunch of particular figures and saying these are the important Irish women poets, and not wanting to do that. So, I mean, we try to have it both ways in a way, in that we do have some chapters on kind of major poets, wanting to kind of deal with those figures in depth. But then we also have chapters that kind of offer surveys of periods, or chapters that take on particular themes or issues that have been really important in Irish women's poetry, such as Catholicism.
I mean, I think a good answer to that would be the long tradition of single poem authors, people who survive in the canon for one single poem, whether short or long. I mean, I think in the case of the Irish language, you have the incredible example of Evelyn Duffney Cunnell, whose poem, it could sustain a chapter all to itself, but, she's a minor author in the sense of not being a self-conscious professional artist, working on her next collection of Blackford Arts Council grant. So if you want to follow the model of the strong author who will command the canon, well, she just isn't that person. I mean, her work is an accident in very important and interesting ways. But if you're looking at somebody anonymous who seems to be an abbess sometime in the 11th century and wrote 4 lines in the margins of an illuminated gospel, well, they have to have a place to go in a book like this, and if it's not a whole chapter devoted to themselves, then we've found, I think, a framework in which to include all kinds of writing from that all the way up to the strong canonical authors.
And one thing you see all the way through the history is that it's a story of groups, right? It's a story of coteries and collectives and networks and women-led publishing presses and all these kinds of ways in which groups get together, communities get together and make poetry. That's very powerfully in the book, I think.
Thank you. I think we're coming up to the time for the first reading.
So David's going to introduce Ciara, I think.
Okay. Well, looking forward to our first featured reading then. Daniela Thanova's chapter has been mentioned a couple of times, a chapter on 20th and 21st century Irish language poets, in which Daniela points out that This is the first generation of Irish language poets in which women can be seen to comfortably outnumber the men writing. And as Daniela observes, far from having lapsed into a confident, placid post-feminism, this generation has been working very hard to counter the historical silencing that they inherit. And who better among them than Ciara, who has been doing so not only through her poetry, but her activism with her generous presence on the scene, having founded REC, the multilingual monthly open mic night in Dublin, and also being the founder of Éireach Ateach Gaelach, a collective of LGBT plus Irish speakers in the arts, working to collaborate creatively and reclaim the history of LGBT presence in the Irish language. Now, for us this evening, she is simultaneously going to be, well, an ambassador for the Irish language and for the poetry of the past that we've just been talking about, minor, and one poet from the 17th century called Una ní Bhrin. Philip Brever, Funavach Granver, Maltaki, Ciara Tá Tráchtar hí sa lear mór seo ar leathnach a dáchéad chuige, agus clógus cáil buinte amach go fuair leathnach íonis, ach go háirithe ar son leachtaí fleachta. Agus meag tnú go mór leis an tafaidú tá dainte acu den ócáid seo. So over to Ciara.
This poem is called O Thugas mo Gráchuit mo Lámh is mo Geala, and it was written by Una ní Bhrin around 1670 about her husband, the scholar Sean O'Nachtan. O Thugas mo Gráchuit mo Lámh is mo Geala, ein uair a bháinchuit a chean óg í nachtan, chorla mo chorda, mo fort leat ní scarhead, mar barlum sa lámh leat, ná an óras na nangal. A stórach, Bhín bio sé mo róí go ceann bliana, gan dada ól ná lón bith díri, mo bhéal do bhéalsa, mo róid do chliamhsa, ag éisteach do glóir glic do hógach mo fianta. Rachi mé héin leat gan éire go súgach, ag féchan is ag éisteach na néin beag go súgra, céad fearlam féin sin, ná féasta na cuarta, a dhéon rá is a héagar, seo mé leat, gan dúilta. And I'll read the translation as well. This is translated by Louis Dupuer. Since I gave you my love, my hand and my word, once and for all, young Sean O'Nachtan, I'll never leave you, in spite of my friends, for I'd rather be with you than dwell with the angels. I could live for a year, I know, my love, not asking for food or drinking a drop, with my mouth on yours, my hand on your heart. Hearing your small talk would heal my hurt. I'd make no delay but go with you gladly, watching and hearing the small birds at play, 100 times better than courtly banquets. My one love, my strength, I could never refuse. I wrote this poem in response to a series of photographs. It was a project with Pontio University in Wales. And the images in the poem are all taken from the series of photographs, kind of what I was looking at and what I wanted to write about initially, and then what I was forced to write about, what I was drawn to write about. Leime in Gaelge ar dús agus tidal an fias ná Iarmhaircht. Burras de scríomh faoi chuirib an chapúil, is suaimhnis na túthe sa chlappolas bug, na an bhean in a lí, is a slinán fínálta, cuair maltach a druma, a crumán, a cum. Níonta mo chrí ní minic a riníam, ach músglíon a masha, mo chócas lum. Is mé an curán galí, a súl le bheláin, is cuineamanacht, ganí taobhlum. So the title Iarmhaircht actually comes from Dineen's dictionary, and it means the loneliness felt at cockcrow. But in English, I just called it solitude. And I talk about the horse's withers here. That's just kind of the ridge in between the two shoulder blades of the horse. Much easier to detail the horse's thin withers and the tranquil pastures under soft pastel light than the woman in slumber, the poke of her shoulder, her sensual curves and waist so slight. I rarely exhibit my most ardent wishes, but her beauty awakens my aching desire. That crescent moon is me, yearning for fullness. And tonight I'll howl without her by my side.
Thank you very much. That was a wonderful reading of those two poems that you could see spoke to each other in really interesting ways, and the past, the Irish language, and translation as well, of course, which is something that the book also covers as well. It's interesting to see somebody translating their own work as well, because the politics around that are interesting.
I'm interested to see the very obvious affinities between the first poem that Ciara read there and the poem I just mentioned before, her recording by Evelyn Dove.
Yeah.
And who knows, I mean, whether Evelyn Dove would have been aware of that poem, but the way in which you have, say, the marriage of the personal, your very personal subject matter, and the inherited conventions of the genre too.
Yeah. And I think the question as to how aware early women poets were of each other is a really interesting one, really difficult one to answer. I mean, it would be the same, I think, in Scotland and Wales as well, how far, and it gets back to your, discussions in the introduction to the volume about how useful is that idea of tradition and thinking back through mothers and those kind of Anglo-American kind of paradigms of women's literary history. It's a very, very interesting question, but you do see those kind of resonances and echoes nevertheless, don't you, that seem unignorable sometimes, which is really interesting. We talked earlier on about the chronological range, and I want now to kind of sort of shift to, I guess, the sort of more recent parts of the history of Irish women's poetry and also of the volume. I wanted to ask you, as editors rather than as kind of scholars, I guess, what do you think when you were editing the book? How did the chapters that you were reading, what did they show you about the development of women's poetry in Ireland, sort of kind of from the 19th into the early 20th century, that you perhaps surprised you or you weren't aware of, or reinforced actually what you did know?
Well, I'm always interested in the question of the poet as a public intellectual, right? The poet as intervening in political life. And that's definitely a thread that you can see coming through that part of the book. So I mean, we have a chapter from Catherine Jones, a kind of sweeping chapter that looks at the engagement of Irish women poets of the Romantic period with politics. And that's a very kind of overt engagement and a relatively straightforward engagement in a way. And then in the revival period, again, you have women poets. That's a kind of it's a very fruitful period for women poets, and they're kind of very much involved in the construction of the nation. And after independence, you have this sort of weird situation where you have this crew of incredibly experimental, innovative, exciting poets. And they're this weird place that they inhabit where modernism is kind of seen as dubious, is kind of seen as derivative. And then also women are, this is a culture that kind of valorizes the domestic role of women and the reproductive roles. So you have these extraordinary people who are negotiating this problem, and they just find a kind of staggering range of ways to reflect on their own roles and to innovate formally within that situation. So I thought that was fascinating. And I'm also always interested in how Irish women poets are at the forefront of responses to Catholicism in Irish society. I think that also comes through, that they're the ones offering the most sophisticated responses. They're kind of registering the damage that Irish Catholicism is doing, especially to women, but they're also salvaging Catholicism as a kind of as having creative potential, and of potentially being the source for a kind of renewal of Irish culture. So for me, those are the kind of the exciting threads.
Yeah, it's really interesting. David?
Well, Ailbhe has just mentioned the inescapable backdrop of moments of historical political crisis. But you take a moment like, say, the First World War and the Revolutionary period, where history is moving in a certain unignorable direction. But poetry doesn't all always go in the same direction unanimously. Poets are branching off on all kinds of B-roads off the highways of history. So if you take a trio of poets like Catherine Tynan, Winifred Letts, who I think we're going to be coming to soon, and Dora Sigerson Shorter, for instance, their responses to World War One are very different and very anguished in their ways. The ways in which the war, because of the Irish contribution, should be seen within a kind of more expansive version of Irish nationalism that we're joining in out of solidarity with our brethren in Belgium or whatever. Or in the case of Dora Sigerson Shorter, living in England, she feels this terrible ambivalence and betrayal even with her relationship with Thomas Hardy, going to pot over what he thought of 1916, and the way in which she almost seems to have died for Ireland, as it were, this self-immolation poetically. There's just so much to be squeezed out of that, in which we do see, for instance, Matthew Cameron writes about that. And the modernist period, which comes after, where again there seems to be an established the Free State narrative. Then we have the B road of Irish modernism, which we were all exhuming around 30 years ago in the persons of all those male poets. And then he has somebody who's often unclassified right altogether, like Frida Lawton, whose death date, I think, may have discovered just in time to go into this book, because until very recently she was Frida Lawton, ? If she's still alive now at the age of 110. I think she died in 1995. We now know. And she also forms such an interesting narrative strand within this book too.
That's really interesting. And thinking about sort of continuities rather than disruptions, when I think about some of the 18th century poets that I was working on, that they do make very political comments, but they do it in very different ways from each other sometimes, but also they are politicized, but they do it in ways sometimes that are gendered, obviously. So they see things that pertain to, for example, a domestic situation from the relationship with England and trade, and how that affects them as women, and how the food that they're trying to put on the table. But they certainly are politicized in ways that actually were quite surprising to me, because some of the poems I was looking at are very conventional panegyrics to, kind of the vice regents coming into Dublin court, but actually beneath that there's much more going on, and I think that's really interesting about that ambivalence as well.
There's such a strong evolutionary sense in your chapter of the typical Anglo-Irish woman poet of that period, who is of course the colonial other, but then she increasingly comes to see herself as the explainer of Ireland to the heedless, the male Britannic presence back in her once home, and that in the act of explaining Ireland like that, she becomes more sympathetic and somehow begins to change sides,
Yeah. Yes, it's really interesting. And thinking then sort of even nearer to us now, the book does talk about contemporary poetry as well, which is again one of the really exciting things about it. It takes us right up to the now and thinking beyond the now, as we talked about before the reading. So what does the book suggest as a whole, do you think, about kind of the state of Irish women's poetry in the now, but also in the last 21 years, is it, of the 20th century? And what do you think it's going to look like? And I think the last chapter does, adumbrate some developments that we see happening already that are very promising and very, very new.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that last chapter is so positive. It's so exciting, right? And so that's Anne Mulhall's chapter. And she writes about transformative energies, right? She talks about how poetry has become involved in social movements and in campaigns for social justice. She writes about experiments with form, and about poetry practitioners transforming poetry institutions, right? And of course about the aesthetic and political vitality of poets of ethnic minority and of migrant backgrounds. So just this kind of explosion of transformation. And she talks about, one thing that I'm particularly interested in is this kind of explosion of long works by women. These book-length poetic works, which there have been a few poets, earlier on who have been doing that, but it seems to have really become a thing. These kind of long book length works that use just an array of different forms of documentary forms and narrative forms and dramatic monologues and all sorts of things. And I think that's just a sign of confidence, isn't it? Right? Of confidence breeding confidence. So that's really exciting to see, I think.
I think that's a very important point, Ailbhe. I mean, you know, the old joke, it's Michael Longley's joke that somebody says, well, you know, where do poems come from? And his answer is, if I knew that, I'd go there. Well, I think that last chapter, it does go there, and it really does go over the horizon and show what is coming down.
Yeah.
The pipes, you know, from the future.
Yeah.
But I think all this transformation that you're talking about, I mean, not least among the items, the things being transformed is the form of the academic book, as in this book, but also I think of the next big generational poetic anthology that might come along. I mean, if you thought naively that all this activity means we'll stick a few extra people on the end of the next book of whatever, of Irish poetry, those long poems, they don't really lend themselves to that kind of, you know, 2 or 3 pages of little lyrics that are that size. It suggests that the very form of the Irish poetic anthology would have to be reimagined rather dramatically, and I think that can only be a good thing.
That's interesting, yeah.
And also the role of the kind of performance spoken voice as well, thinking of Julie Morrissey, for example, you know, and how do you then capture that, the performance as well, which is really interesting. Rachael Hegarty is now going to read a poem by Winifred Letts, and she's also one of her own poems. They're both river poems, which I think is really interesting because we've all been kind of really had a renewal in our appreciation of nature, I think, in terms of lockdown, and our daily walks, the rivers and in the countryside have been very, very important. So I think everyone's going to really enjoy both of the poems that Rachael reads. Could you tell me something about what Winifred Letts adds to your history? I think Rachel's going to talk about her context and who she was, but what do you, I think David, you touched on it just now, but I wondered if you could kind of summarize, either of you, what her presence in the book tells us.
She also is a rather mysterious figure, because I did note in reading her again yesterday that in Lucy Collins' excellent anthology, she's described as being born in Wexford. But I think in our book, she's described as being born in London, was it? She moves around. We haven't know very much about her, but she did live to be around 90, so all kinds of different phases, like a lovely elegy for sing, in very sing-like revivalist style that I was reading. But then side by side, Elisa's anthology is a poem, a very hard-edged poem about a child in a tenement in Dublin and the kind of vision of poverty there. But then come the war poems in her own particular response to that. The poem about the deserter and that the mother at home thinking of the child's sacrifice, unaware that the son has been shot as a deserter. And I'm sure that's going to come through strongly in what we're about to hear now. All those different strands.
In her chapter, Lucy Collins writes about how she's a poet who's formally conventional, but who is challenging us in how she shifts sympathies, or she offers something other than a singular perspective on events. So she's always challenging us with unexpected tone or unexpected image, which I think is something, again, a kind of recurring theme in the book, that if you have a very limited set of categories of what's conventional and what's experimental, what's new, that you're going to miss a whole lot of stuff that often women's poetry is challenging in ways that we haven't learned to notice. So I'm going to introduce Rachael. Just going to check my notes so I do it right. So Rachael Hegarty's first book was Flight Paths Over Finglas, which came out in 2018. And that was a portrait of the working class community in which the poet grew up. And it was kind of championed by Paula Meehan, who described it as a joyous and clear-eyed book that draws on and augments the song tradition of an artistically rich area of North Dublin, and opens it to the critique and edge of contemporary poetry practice, to the winds of Japan, Boston, Walden Pond, Emily Dickinson's garden. We have a chapter in the book on Paula Meehan by Catherine Kirkpatrick, and she discusses, among other things, how Meehan's poetry embraces a public role in recovering and bearing witness to working class lives, but is never only a poetry of kind of one Dublin parish. Meehan's work is rooted in Dublin, but it intersects with ideas and strands in the whole wider weave of world poetry. And I think in this ability to be at once sort of gorgeously attuned to a particular place at a particular moment, but also alert to the wider currents of history and identity, which are intersecting in that moment, Rachael Hegarty is one of Meehan's inheritors. And at the same time, her voice is distinctive and joyously so. So Rachael Hegarty's second book is one of those long form poems that we've just been talking about. It's called May Day 1974, and it brings together found poems, sonnets composed from archival documents with ballads to commemorate the people killed in the Dublin Monaghan bombing in 1974. And so it's an act of poetic witness and a commemoration, but also a protest that humanizes the people that were killed and sort of recovering them from becoming anonymous victims. So it's a huge honor and a pleasure to have Rachael Hegarty joining us this evening.
Hello there, my name is Rachael Hegarty. I come from Finglas in Dublin in Ireland, and I am delighted and honoured to be invited here today to help launch a history of Irish women's poetry. It's a great act of radical recovery that Ailbhe, Darcy and David Wheatley have taken on in recovering these Irish women poets and bringing them back to the fore, and also to look at living poets as well. But today I'm going to read a poem by the wonderful Winifred Letts, who was one of those women who might have been lost to the canon, but we're finding her and bringing her back home. I first discovered her when I read a book back in my student days around the 1990s called Women's Poetry of the First World War. And I remember reading a poem called Oxford Spires by this one called Winifred Letts, and I was thinking, who she was when she's at home. So lo and behold, she was born to an Irish ma and an English da just outside Manchester. But like me, she spent most of her childhood at that space between the River Liffey and Phoenix Park, and she loved being beside the Liffey or by the Irish Sea. So even though she lived to be 90 years old, she spent most of her life in Ireland. A very interesting woman. She was a poet, a playwright, a novelist, and she also trained as what they called a medical masseuse, what we would call today a physiotherapist. And she spent time in the army camps during World War I, nursing the sick soldiers and the wounded soldiers and the mutilated soldiers, and she helped indeed many soldiers who lost limbs in those wars. But the poem I'm going to read today is called A Song for Ailbhe House. Ailbhe House is an old windmill up beyond Lucan there. As I said, she spent a lot of her time, Winifred, either the Phoenix Park end of the Liffey or the Lucan end of the Liffey. She was happy out. But Ailbhe House was an old mill house. The water mill went round and ground down the wheat into the flour. So this is about that place, and it struck me. It's from her collection called More Songs of Leinster, written after the war, and it struck me how much peace and nature is there. So not only was the mill a place of sustenance for people who were hungry, but any place beside the rivers and nature is also a place of other kinds of sustenance. So here we are. A Song for Ailbhe House by Winifred Letts. Ailbhe drowses beside the shining weir. The merry river passes, singing all the day. The beaches bend to catch her. Why must you go, my dear? You gleaming, lovely Liffey, so beryl bright and clear. But still, they never hold her. She always slides away, singing, 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 as she turns the wheel. God be with the miller, God be with the mill, God be with the people who have their bins to fill, and God be with the sorry folk who hunger for a meal. Ailbhe drowses with windows open wide. Great beaches stand as sentries on guard at either side. The heron is watching where the shallows run. The kingfisher passes, a jewel in the sun. All day the river murmurs, peace within the hall, peace upon the threshold, peace inside this house, peace upon the sun and cat and the busy mouse, peace upon the garden and on the baskin wall, the heavy laden fruit trees, the low humming hives, peace upon the barnyard, the red cock and his wives, that God may smile upon you here and give his peace to all. There she is, the wonderful Winifred Lest. She lived from 1882 to 1972, 90 years old. Absolutely gorgeous. So I was invited to read one of my own poems, and I thought I would read a river poem as well, because I grew up in Finglas beside the River Talca, and many days were spent Fair Isle having adventures by the River Talca. So this poem is from my second collection called May Day 1974. So on the 17th of May, as many people would know, in 1974, we had the Dublin and Monaghan bombings, the so-called worst day of the Troubles. By the end of that day, there was 34 people dead. I was on Talbot Street with my ma and my younger brother Daisy when the second bomb exploded. However, the O'Brien family, John O'Brien, aged 24, Anna O'Brien, aged 22, Jacqueline O'Brien, aged 17 months, and Marie O'Brien, aged 5 months, were all on Parnell Street when the first bomb exploded and the whole family was killed. So I wanted to reclaim some of the lives rather than the 3 sentences they were given in the Barron report, and I created ballads for the 34 dead. So this is a ballad for Anna O'Brien. What I miss about Finglas are the trees by the Talca. The river made the valley and the valley gave us trees. When the priest in Gardner Street drones on, I mouth me prayers like the others. But really, I'd be back by the Talca, walking the trail of trees in me head. I hear me granny's voice, soft whisperings over the rattle of rosaries, and her telling me, trees never sin. She names off the trees and their markers, the willow with its weeping limbs, the ash and its papery bark, the oak's sturdy trunk and tiny toppers, and the hazel with its nuts for hungry gaps. When the time comes, I'll show our girls the markers for different kinds of trees. I'll take them to the elder where me and John carved out our names when we was courting. They'll likely laugh at us, ones, once young, and carving love on a tree by the Talca. Thanks very much, and best of luck with this wonderful new book, A History of Irish Women's Poetry. May it go on and on and on. Thank you.
Thank you to Rachel for that wonderful reading, and to echo her sentiments as well. That this is the start of something, not the end. And I think what we've been talking about that all the way through, in terms of the contents of the volume, but also the outward trajectory, I think, of the final chapter at the end as well. So I think that was a very fitting tribute to yeah. not to excuse the pun, to what you've achieved in the volume, and to very, very, very moving poems. And again, the connections between the 2 poems are also interesting, as they were with the previous reading too. Lots of food for thought there, I think. Now, we don't seem to have any questions, unless anybody would like to ask our editors any questions while we have them captured in Zoom.
Didn't foresee this eventuality.
No. So many comments and congratulations, lots of lovely comments on your achievement. People have really enjoyed the evening, but no questions. We must have been very...
covered everything.
in what we're saying. I mean, I don't want to spring anything on either of you, but I just to go back to what David was saying while we have time. it's kind of what next, not necessarily for you, but you were talking about the next anthology would not look like this. Now, what do you think? I've been editing an anthology myself at the moment from thinking about anthologies. What do you think is the future for anthologies, and particularly an anthology, the next anthology about Irish women's poetry? I wonder, I mean, would it be more of a digital interactive? Is that where you think it's going, or just some ideas? I think it was just a very interesting kind of proposition you set up there, David.
Mm. Well, I think that from a commercial point of view, such a book, maybe my sense of that book has always been hamstrung by the belief that there would be such an amount of copyright permissions to pay to Faber and Faber for the Davis Healy and Paul Muldoon that you'd need to reproduce, that would be just a doomed endeavor. But I think maybe to follow the logic of what I was saying earlier, if you just do take that leap off the edge and embrace the condition of the pluralized now and let that work carry the anthology instead, it might be more commercially viable than if you had to pay like £500,000 to Faber and Faber to make it happen.
Yeah, that's true.
I mean, I think that one thing that editors of anthologies have not done in the past, it seems to me, is to go and ask people what should be in the anthology, and that's something that I would want to do if I was editing anthology, right? I think that's where the mistake gets made, is where if you can't see it, it's not there. But if you go and ask a load of people to write essays about Irish women's poetry, they show you a whole lot of stuff that you didn't see that was always there. Mm-hmm. So being aware of that and being able to go and ask questions, I think, could result in a much more interesting anthology.
Yeah, Roddy Lumsden did that, didn't he, with that Blood Axe anthology that he kindly put both of us into.
You're quite right.
And I think that made a massive difference. I mean, the way there are well-known poems that their own authors might come to dislike intensely, and they might, groan at seeing in print. But if you have an editor who actually does want to make something creative of the occasion of the anthology and work with the writers rather than just saying, this, and this, like as though you were in a shop, I think that also is an act of creative anthologizing. And
I think that's true.
The rewards are there to be reaped.
Yeah, absolutely. Some of the poet that I talk about in my chapter, Catherine Phillips, because I think that the chapter before that talks about more extensively. She's been heavily anthologized in kind of anthologies on early modern women's poetry, but it's always the kind of royalist poems or the poems of female friendship. It's never been the poems about Ireland or her poem on the Welsh language. So I guess my question is, if there were to be a more conventional anthology, would the experience of editing this volume shift how you might think about which bits of the poet's work to put in? Because in the anthology I'm doing, we're deliberately choosing things that talk about place and locality rather than the kind of set piece poems. And some of the people are obscure, so there wouldn't be those set pieces, but sometimes there are those set pieces. And I think the interesting point about the long poem as well, and what do you do with that when that actually becomes a kind of cultural phenomenon, if you like? How do you then anthologize that? I mean, sort of the dreaded extract that all of us who've taught poetry are kind of dread in a way, but sometimes of necessity have to use in terms of teaching as well. Because one of the things I think is really heartening about this is how does this affect the next generation of critics and scholars as well, people who want to work on Irish women's poetry from whatever particular period, and how this might shape their perceptions and might shape how we teach the material as well. Yeah.
Well, I don't know how far along the road you are with the anthology. I know that has been emerging from your own scholarly work. But I think, if we're such a project to happen, the groundwork has been laid for it. I mean, somebody's got to do it at some point. I mean, as far as using it for teaching is concerned, I hope that with the large numbers of people who've tuned in to listen to us tonight, there seems to be enough of a groundswell to get this book into an affordable paperback too, so more people, including students, can read it.
Yeah. Ailbhe, any thoughts?
I mean, I think that certainly was doing the project was partly for the person that I was, for me anyway, as a kind of young poet and as a young scholar, and thinking, well, I might have made different decisions about what work I studied and what work I wrote about if there'd been easier access to the whole of Irish literature, because you tend to go with what's easily on the shelf. Mm-hmm. so yeah, I hope that the project does change how, what can be used in the classroom, what's used kind of under pressure. I can't remember what you asked in the first place about the anthology. Oh, I was just going to say that there's an anthology, Stares and Whispers, which is an anthology of poetry of disability, and it's a conventional book, but it comes accompanied with video poems online and a full recording of the book, audio recording, and one of the things that happened when that book was put together was that sort of new work was triggered by the need to kind of produce the poetry in different forms, and had a kind of creative effect on the poets participating. So I thought that was cool, and just throw it out there. I think, if you were trying to do honor to the poetry of the now in the Irish poetry, I think you'd want to do that kind of thing.
Yeah, and I think it's especially also in terms of the early poetry as well, that was spoken and composed, not written,
yes.
Composed, and it's song, lots of songs, particularly in the Scottish Gaelic tradition. The song is really, really important, and ballads as well, and how oral kind of poems are passed on, and to how do you kind of get that across. And I think the kind of audio element is really important, and maybe for translation as well. I mean, one of my fantasies was that you could have this kind of online interactive anthology whereby you could sort of read the Irish and listen to it in English, or read the English or whatever. So you weren't just kind of reading the English translation if you didn't have Welsh or Irish, or that would, for me, would be really interesting as well for the early poets, but maybe for the later poets too. But I think there was one question I think is really great to finish on, which is no pressure, plans for a sequel?
Oh my God. What would the sequel be?
Not an anthology, another edited. Given how fast the field's moving, maybe you have enough material in a couple of years.
Yeah. Another history of Irish women's poetry.
Secret history.
Yes.
Great, thanks ever so much, and we're coming to the end now of this evening's event, which I've certainly found hugely enjoyable, and really enjoyed chatting to Ailbhe and David. And so I want to congratulate you again for such a brilliant achievement. It really is groundbreaking, and hopefully it will change how we think about Irish women's poetry, how we teach it, how we respond to it, the kind of poets that we read, poets that we may not have heard about, that will now go and look them up and buy their books and read them as well, because it seems to me that's the end of great criticism, is that people actually want to go and read the poetry. And it's one of the really great things about this volume as well, that there's so many detailed readings of the poems themselves. It's not just kind of summary, and I think that's one of its richness, the richness of it, and its real strength. So we did want to say something about where you might buy she said tantalizingly holding up and of course all good bookshops, the best of which of course is in MoLI, but I think there's been problems with distribution, so if you were really keen to get it straight away, I think the website, Ailbhe, did you want to say?
Yeah, that's right. Cambridge University Press website are offering 20% off, and the secret code is Darcy21. So that's very memorable. And yeah, if you just plug that in, you'll get your 20% off. It is a very expensive book at the moment, but like David said, we're hoping that there's so much interest in it that we will be able to produce an affordable paperback.
Yeah, let's hope so. And I think the link's just been dropped in the chat there by Laura. Thanks very much for that. So thank you again, and thank you very much again to Denise Hanrahan and the Embassy and the Consulates General, all to the team at MoLI. Thank you for your technical expertise. Everything went very smoothly. And thank you to everyone who joined us. It's a shame we can't see you, but when the next volume comes out, we'll see everybody in person. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you so much, Sarah.